Welcome back. The weather is just crazy right now. When you start thinking again, we have a balance of weather right here, and things do need balance. And when you start looking at all the crazy news today, such as the economic news that seemed positive, the interesting stories we talked about earlier, tallest man reached 8 feet 3 inches today, which is pretty tall. And, the Fed's saying the labor market's improved, and of course, this shooting massacre over in Afghanistan. There's this huge element of balance. Grant Courtney joins us again, who's a bankruptcy attorney and practiced law in Washington State for over 24 years. And, first, welcome back, Grant.
Thank you.
How you doing?
Pretty good.
Good. So does the snow affect the ferries?
No, they just put chains on the propellers.
Does that work?
Yeah.
You've done a lot in bankruptcy, and small banks, small creditors are certainly somebody who are subject to this because, as we were just talking to Keith, who's going to join us in a little bit, they don't have the huge resources to go after people. Talk a little bit about, what happens when small banks or creditors actually start to maybe collect on a debt that hasn't been paid.
Well, their first concern and primary concern is getting the money in as quickly as possible at the lowest possible cost, which isn't always consistent with one another. Unfortunately, the litigation process can be very expensive, and it can also be time-consuming because you have to follow due process. Everyone's got their right to their day in court. Certain defendants are very good at dragging these processes out. And the bank, as I said, the banks that I've represented, even one bad debt can be a significant concern for them because it represents a fairly large portion of their portfolio, particularly if they've been involved in construction lending. They may have gone into a project thinking that they were very well secured with a large amount of real property or capital being contributed by the builder or the developer. And the reality is that values of property drops significantly and quickly, or the builder may have not necessarily lied, but been creative in their financing and in their accounting and made themselves look a little bit better than they actually are. And so there isn't a ready source of collection resources that are available to the bank. They need to be realistic about what they really want to do and how much they're willing to spend to do it.
So what happens? I mean, these banks, they can't maybe get their money, and maybe the business owners can't pay the bills. As you said, they have cash flow problems. Maybe the project didn't get sold or a building doesn't get sold. So when this happens, I mean, it's kind of a domino effect, isn't it? All of a sudden, the individual can't pay, and then the bank has debts maybe they can't pay or interest they can't pay. I mean, talk a little about that domino effect, I guess, or the effects that, it starts almost grassroots, but it really does go up.
It does, and most often it depends on the community that they're in. We've come out of this to a certain degree in the late 2000s, 2008 through 2010. There was a real domino effect going on. You had a number of banks which had really extended themselves to the limit in terms of making loans on projections based on the belief that a developer could build 18 homes, 20 homes, 30 homes, whatever it was going to be, have a cash flow, and essentially they were betting that they could sell a home quickly enough to finance the next one down the road. Now that bank is in a position where the developer isn't building, the real estate broker isn't marketing because there's nothing coming in. I'm most familiar with Kitsap County. We went from dozens and dozens of local banks to where really the major banks now have consolidated. Umpqua has bought this bank.
They're huge, aren't they? They're everywhere, it seems.
They're bigger than I ever thought they were, but then I was talking with, I'm of counsel with a firm in Los Angeles, and they're dealing with them down there. And I had always thought of them as a small regional bank.
They were like the one in Bellevue on Northeast 8th, and then we were down in Oregon. They're everywhere in Oregon.
Yeah, they are.
There's Umpqua Milk. I don't know if that's anything to do with the bank, but,
It's like when I went to Miami on business one time, and there's this huge Washington Mutual building downtown. I thought, how did they get here?
Yeah.
And we saw what that did for them
right
in the long run.
So,
but these banks, which were really the moving factor in small communities, in a lot of ways, suddenly became institutionalized. You didn't know who the teller was. And that's where the domino effect here was, is the community lost, smaller communities lost a source of ready capital. And I think that's had a long-term effect on the builders and developers that I've spoken with and that I represent.
So then when a bank, what does a bank do? At some point in time, there is no money. And the money's not there. They can't just go collect it.
Right.
So what do they do?
Well, if they're fortunate enough to stay in business, and a lot of them weren't, the FDIC came in, essentially bought a lot of that bad debt at a discount. But what they do is they come to someone like me and say, look, we need to liquidate whatever assets are out there. Most of them, if they've done their work up front, have personal guarantees. So in addition to whatever the collateral is, the physical, the real estate, they may try to go after the individuals that were behind the development. So they're going to begin a lawsuit. And typically what they want to do, if it's an income-producing property, let's say that there was an apartment building that's generating some cash, they're going to go and they're going to retain a receiver. They're going to have the state courts appoint a receiver who comes in and is an officer of the court, but his responsibility or her responsibility is to run that business, to make sure that the rents and the income that's being generated is actually going where it's supposed to be going. A lot of times what the banks are finding out is, again, I wouldn't necessarily call it fraud, but somebody needs to pay other bills. The bank may be the last one that they choose to direct money to. So they put a receiver in place. Their job is to make sure that the property is maintained in an adequate fashion, to use that money to complete the project or to liquidate it in as orderly a fashion as possible. That keeps you out of bankruptcy. I think the banks prefer that simply because then they're in control. They're overseeing the asset through the receiver.
And are banks are they willing to work with people at this point in time? If the banks are in business, are they willing to work with people or companies?
My experience right now is that they're far more willing to work with them than they were even a year and a half ago. I know I'm dealing with a couple of people on the island who had developments which were bottom up, to be quite honest, within the last 8 to 10 months. I think people are optimistic. They've actually had some sales going on. The banks don't want to incur the cost of an attorney or a law firm of going after these. They know that on the back end of this, let's say you've got a project that the builder was actually doing the work, but he's only 2/3 of the way done with his project. Well, the bank's got to make a decision. Do they let him complete it, closely monitoring where the money's going, making sure the money's actually going to the subcontractors and whoever's actually doing the work? Or do they completely take over and advance that funds on their own? To be blunt, banks are not general contractors. They're not experienced in it. They don't know what they're doing. They're not real estate brokers. Even to the extent they're involved in the mortgage business, they don't have the experience that's necessary to do that type of work. Right. And so it makes more sense. I think they've learned their lesson. It's making more sense to work with the developer as if they feel they've got an honest developer, someone who's truly committed to the project, that it's easier for them to continue to work with them and get the project done and try and get as much out of it as they can, and then reserve their rights on the back end so that if they take a loss, they can go after the developer individually. Yeah.
Well, Grant, we have to go to break. Thanks so much for joining us. And there is that big key of, I think, banks are more willing to work with you now than maybe they were. And it's kind of like what you said. The small banks, they can go out of business. You can literally put a community bank out of business, but if you talk to them, maybe you can be a better part of the community, it would seem. When we come back, in another life, I have a boss. He's here. He's going to tell you all about what's coming up in the mortgage world, because he's already built one of the biggest mortgage companies in the country. My name's Ben Brashen. Keith Tibbles is coming up. You're listening to Brashenomics.